There are moments in history where the air seems to thicken, not with smoke or storm, but with something less visible and far more potent, a kind of atmospheric reckoning, the kind that doesn't knock, but quietly shifts the furniture of the soul before anyone notices it entered. This is one of those seasons, not just because of the chaos echoing through the cities or the tremors that seem to pass between nations like a secret being whispered too loudly, but because something overhead has begun to stir, not in the mythic sense, but in the strange convergence between light, gravity, and consciousness that even science can't quite name without sounding poetic. Some will hear this and dismiss it, and that's perfectly fine. Not every frequency reaches every ear. But for those who have been walking around with a quiet sense that their dreams aren't entirely their own, that some of them may have been planted by the sky itself, what's coming next will feel less like information and more like recognition. Not everyone notices when the internal compass begins to spin, but for those standing still long enough, it's hard to miss. There's a kind of current, an invisible river passing through everything, as if the earth and the stars are quietly rehearsing a dance they've performed before. Only this time, something is different. The rhythm is faster, the stage feels larger, and the participants, well, they don't always know they've been cast until the spotlight hits. That's the paradox of awakening. It rarely announces itself in words, only in patterns, sudden dreams, unexpected encounters, that lingering question that keeps showing up in different forms. What am I becoming? If that question has echoed even once in recent weeks, then maybe this isn't just a coincidence of timing, but a convergence of readiness. This phase, marked so visibly by the supermoon, is not just a lunar event. It's a mirror held up by the cosmos itself, a gravitational pull not just on oceans, but on inner tides long suppressed. What rises during this time may feel unfamiliar, even uninvited, but it isn't unnatural. These shifts have always been part of the larger rhythm. They just needed the right moment to be heard. And perhaps that moment is now. The world, after all, doesn't just spin, it listens. And when it senses alignment, it responds in strange and beautiful ways. The question is, will the message be noticed before it fades back into silence? Curiosity might surface quietly, like a ripple in the back of the mind. What makes this moon feel different? It's not just brightness or size, it's pressure. Not the kind that pushes from the outside, but the type that draws from within. Subtle yet insistent, as if something unseen is trying to speak through the bones of the world. This lunar presence isn't just poetic. It alters the architecture of the living. It moves oceans, yes, but it also pulls on the silent reservoirs tucked deep inside the human body. The blood, the breath, the unseen circuits of thought. Each pulse becomes a little louder under its watchful light. What science describes in terms of mass and orbit, experience interprets as tension and release. The magnitude of this pull is unmistakable for anyone still enough to notice. There's a peculiar tuning that happens when planetary forces intensify. It's like standing near an amplifier and suddenly realizing the static has meaning. Not everyone feels it the same way. Some shake it off like a dream forgotten before breakfast. But for those who move slightly out of phase with the mainstream rhythm, this moment rings different. It sharpens perception, thickens intuition, and brings up questions that don't belong to the surface mind. What if this isn't just another lunar cycle, but a kind of spiritual checkpoint? What if everything realigned just a bit, while no one was paying attention? When the moon edges closest to Earth in its orbit, the result isn't just a visual phenomenon. It's a vibrational shift that seems to stretch beyond physics. The sky may wear a brighter mask, but beneath that glow lies a tension both primal and precise. Something about its nearness rewrites the atmosphere, as if the night itself is holding its breath. And in that stillness, perception sharpens. This isn't just light playing tricks. It's a field of influence brushing against the seams of the inner world, where even the most dormant sensations stir like embers catching wind. There are those who experience this moment as nothing more than a scenic event, and yet, for others, it marks the arrival of a strange internal resonance, one that floods the body with currents difficult to define. The pull isn't just tidal, it's cellular. Emotions, once neatly folded, begin to unfold without permission. Thoughts loop louder. The past walks back into the room with old questions. Why now? Why this memory? It's as if the body itself is acting as an antenna, drawing in signals not yet processed, not yet named. There are phases when something beneath the surface seems to stir with more urgency, when the interior becomes crowded, not with noise, but with pressure. Not random, not accidental. These moments often arrive like internal earthquakes, subtle in sound, but seismic in effect. The heightened energy of the supermoon acts as a spark to these shifts, accelerating the shedding of inner debris long overdue for release. What no longer resonates starts to dissolve, not always neatly, but necessarily. Old emotional currents rise to the surface, not to punish, but to exit. And in their wake, an unfamiliar stillness begins to take shape. Ever wonder how much of the present is cluttered by echoes of the past? In these charged windows of time, the mind loosens its grip, and something else takes the wheel, an inner compass recalibrating to match a larger field of intelligence. What arrives isn't always rational, but it carries weight, fleeting impressions, symbolic dreams, intuitive flashes. It's as if some kind of system reboot is in progress, issuing fragments of clarity in the form of emotion, memory, or even discomfort. The body, too, speaks in new languages: tightness in the chest, a dull ache behind the eyes, sensitivity that makes fluorescent lights feel like thunder. It's not all in the mind. The entire sensory field becomes a mirror for what's moving through. Intensity often carries a disguise. It arrives looking like disruption, fatigue, or even disorientation. But beneath that surface lies the architecture of growth. Not every strain is a sign of misalignment. Some are simply the symptoms of expansion. When the field of energy thickens and the air becomes harder to read, staying close to what's real becomes essential. Touching the earth, focusing on breath, sipping water slowly. These aren't rituals for escape. They're reminders of what the body already knows. That transformation doesn't require force. It requires space. And sometimes the only way to make room for it is to drop into stillness. It's easy to mistake spiritual acceleration for chaos. The current gets stronger, the sense is more alert, and the sense of identity starts to blur around the edges. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the breakdown of old structure is exactly what clarity looks like before it introduces itself. The light that seems too bright is the same light that reveals the forgotten corners. And in that moment of re-illumination, the question isn't, what is happening to me? But, what part of me is finally being seen? There are certain windows in time where the veil between selves, inner and outer, feels unusually thin. The supermoon, with its silent authority and gravitational insistence, amplifies more than tides. It stirs the emotional circuitry that threads through groups, families, strangers, everyone. And for those who move through life with heightened perception, this moment can feel less like observation and more like saturation. It's not just emotion rising from within. It's a tide coming from every direction, indistinguishable at times from one's own. And perhaps this is what makes these phases so disorienting. When personal boundaries begin to dissolve, how does one know what truly belongs? The pressure doesn't always come as an epiphany. More often, it shows up in the body before it makes sense in the mind. A tightening in the skull, a sudden heaviness around the shoulders, or a fatigue that arrives without reason. These aren't random. They are signals. They reveal how much the emotional noise of others has entered the system uninvited. This isn't weakness. It's signal sensitivity. It's the price of deep receptivity in a world that constantly broadcasts chaos. And in that flood of vibration, it becomes easy to misread the landscape, easier still to carry weight that was never assigned. There are times when the mind feels like a crowded intersection, signals crossing, lights flashing, and no clear direction to follow. Under the weight of amplified celestial frequencies, clarity can slip through the cracks, leaving a fog where once there was focus. It's not uncommon in such moments for thoughts to feel secondhand, as though borrowed from voices not one's own. When surrounded by others in emotional flux, their unspoken narratives begin to blend, creating a frequency that's hard to separate from the self. Confusion doesn't always arrive loudly. It often comes quietly, dressed as emotional weather that changes without warning. Ever felt your mood shift for no apparent reason? Maybe the reason wasn't yours to begin with. This blurring doesn't stop with thoughts. It seeps into the senses as well. Ordinary lighting becomes too sharp, almost surgical, as if reality itself is turned up too bright. Sounds that once faded into the background now hit with percussion. The hum of electricity, the scrape of fabric, even the temperature of the air. Each becomes exaggerated, intrusive, real in a way that's hard to ignore. And it's not just the skin reacting. It's the field around the body registering pressure, a kind of invisible touch that lingers longer than it should. In that hypersensitive state, the world doesn't just appear more vivid, it becomes more demanding. When perception sharpens, memory follows. It doesn't arrive gently, it returns with weight, clarity, and sometimes with the sting of moments thought long buried. The supermoon, acting less like a distant orb and more like a signal tower, stirs the timelines inside the body. Conflicts thought resolved echo again, not in logic, but in feeling. A conversation from years ago resurfaces with the same edge it once carried. The names, the faces, the atmosphere, all return in high resolution, as if time momentarily folds inward. And isn't it strange how emotion can resurrect itself without asking permission? But it doesn't stop with the personal. This same sensitivity seems to stretch across the skin of the collective. World events, once filtered through distance or habit, now feel as if they're happening in the next room. A headline isn't just read, it lands. A tragedy across the ocean feels like an ache beneath the ribs. The sadness that rises isn't theoretical, it's visceral. And in these moments, the line between empathy and exhaustion begins to blur. Ever wondered why some news stories linger while others fade? Perhaps the stories that stay mirror something already moving within. When certain frequencies heighten, what was hidden no longer remains quiet. Emotional fragments, once tucked beneath the daily rhythm, rise into awareness not to punish, but to be processed. This is the supermoon's most misunderstood gift. A luminous mirror held so close, it reflects not just the face, but the feeling beneath it. What emerges may be sharp, even disorienting, but its purpose is not disruption, it is restoration. These surfacings offer the chance to name what was never named, to hold what was once too heavy, and in that holding, a kind of lightness begins to return. Isn't it curious how release often comes disguised as discomfort? With emotional residue being stirred, perception itself begins to stretch. What was once felt only vaguely becomes vividly known. Instinct sharpens, not as guesswork, but as inner clarity that requires no justification. The world doesn't suddenly explain itself more clearly, but something inside becomes more capable of hearing what was always there. In moments like these, intuitive insight doesn't just flicker, it floods. Patterns become visible, people's energy becomes readable, and decisions that once seemed clouded begin to resolve themselves without debate. Perception has its own seasons, times when it softens, times when it sharpens, and occasionally it becomes so precise that even the smallest interaction carries a vibration too distinct to ignore. During these rare windows, truth doesn't wait for evidence. It presents itself in feeling. A handshake carries a signal. A smile reveals its tension. Words become less relevant as the atmosphere around them takes center stage. In these moments, discernment feels less like analysis and more like resonance. The invisible becomes readable, and the question arises, how much of what is known has nothing to do with what was said? This sensory awakening often spills into dream space, but these aren't ordinary dreams. They arrive with layers, sometimes luminous, sometimes cryptic, yet always significant. Sleep no longer feels like escape, but immersion into a parallel current where symbols speak louder than sentences. Time stretches, emotion magnifies. Entire stories unfold in minutes, leaving behind impressions that linger well past morning. Some dreams bring closure, others bring instruction. Occasionally they reveal paths long obscured, hinting not just at possibilities, but necessities. Ever woken up certain of a truth no one else told? There are phases when instinct outpaces reason, when the body makes choices before the mind understands them. A sudden shift in plans, a pull away from certain people, a quiet refusal to enter spaces that once felt familiar. These impulses don't always come with explanations. They simply arrive. And during intensified energetic windows, like those shaped by the supermoon, these inner directives grow stronger. What once passed unnoticed now signals as a full body alert. It may feel abrupt, even irrational, but beneath the surface, something precise is at work. A navigational system recalibrating to avoid what drains, delays, or distorts. Interestingly, this same sensitivity doesn't only repel, it also attracts. New paths begin to light up without warning. A book appears. A stranger speaks a line that echoes something long buried. A door opens that was never seen before. It's not about prediction, it's about alignment. These nudges don't just point the way forward, they reveal it. When timing synchronizes with readiness, opportunity often appears dressed as coincidence. Ever felt an unexplainable yes rise before the question was fully asked? There are seasons when silence becomes magnetic, when the background noise of daily life, once tolerable, begins to sting. During heightened energetic cycles, especially under the pressure of amplified lunar pull, the body instinctively searches for stillness, not just to rest, but to recalibrate. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is, in truth, a return inward. It's the spirit pulling its roots out of overstimulated soil to find ground that can actually nourish, and it often happens before the mind fully understands what's been set in motion. This isn't about avoidance. It's about saturation. When everything is louder, voices, thoughts, even the feeling of a room, the desire to be alone isn't rooted in separation, but self-preservation. Sensitivity becomes a lens so refined that even casual interactions feel abrasive. The energy of others doesn't just pass by, it clings, and the spaces once comforting begin to echo too sharply. Crowds feel heavier, words feel thicker. Have you ever walked into a familiar place and suddenly felt like your body no longer fits the room? There are times when the world feels muted, not in volume, but in relevance. Conversations once urgent fade into the background. Obligations feel weightless. Even time itself seems to slow, asking for less action and more awareness. What emerges is a quiet pull inward, a soft disconnection from everything that doesn't echo truth. It's not escapism, it's refinement, an unspoken invitation to leave behind what distracts and trace a deeper current running below the surface of daily routine. And in that detachment, a strange kind of clarity begins to bloom. Without external noise, the internal voice becomes unmistakable. Insights arrive not through effort, but through atmosphere. Thoughts stretch into reflection. Questions no longer demand answers. They simply ask to be heard. This is the value of stillness. It doesn't fix, it reveals. And in that revelation, direction often reappears. Not like a roadmap, but more like a gravitational pull towards something previously obscured. Purpose doesn't need to shout when the distractions are quiet. Ever noticed how the most important thoughts are the ones that show up when no one is asking for them? When the atmosphere sharpens, so does the body's ability to sense disruption. Under the influence of intensified cosmic fields, especially during lunar surges, subtle shifts in emotional frequency become as noticeable as temperature changes. Spaces feel louder. People feel heavier. What once seemed harmless now carries a texture, an energetic residue that's hard to ignore. The body, acting as a kind of spiritual antenna, begins to interpret these signals not through logic, but through sensation. A room filled with suppressed emotion might feel suffocating. A single glance can suddenly feel invasive. Ever walked into a space and felt the need to leave before a word was spoken? This isn't imagination, it's resonance. The sensitivity heightened during these cycles doesn't fabricate discomfort, it decodes it. Anger, sorrow, jealousy, these aren't just emotions, they radiate. And in this phase of amplification, their presence becomes almost tactile. Physical responses, tightness in the chest, pressure in the forehead, a sudden drop in energy, aren't signs of weakness. They're indicators that the field around the body has become too saturated to filter quietly. And when the threshold tips, withdrawal isn't avoidance, it's survival. A necessary response to re-establish spiritual equilibrium. In times when energy becomes dense and vibrations around the body shift rapidly, establishing a personal perimeter is more than just a preference. It's essential architecture. The body, the mind, the spirit, each has its own filtration system. But under cosmic pressure, even those systems reach capacity. This is where intentional practices become more than ritual. They become reinforcement. Whether through the image of a radiant field shielding the skin, the grounding presence of mineral elements, or the subtle clearing effect of earthborne smoke, these acts serve as tuning forks, restoring coherence where disruption has taken hold. They don't just push energy away. They remind the internal compass of its natural position. These protective gestures are not about superstition. They're about signal clarity. A crystal resting in the pocket